Looking back, I can't believe I ignored all the signs. I thought I was buying a thoughtful gift for my daughter. I had no idea that porcelain doll would bring with it something far darker, a presence that still haunts my memories to this day. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was walking through a local antique store, searching for something unique to give my daughter for her birthday. She'd always loved old-fashioned things, and when I saw that porcelain doll sitting on a shelf, I thought it was perfect. The doll was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. It had delicate features, pale skin, rosy cheeks, and dark, glassy eyes that seemed to shimmer under the shop's dim lighting. It wore a faded Victorian-style dress with lace trim, and its hair was made of fine, real-looking blonde curls. "That one's special," the shopkeeper said with a strange smile. "It came from an estate sale a few towns over. Been here a while, nobody seems to want it." Looking back, I should have asked why. But at the time, I just thought the doll was a hidden gem, and I couldn't wait to see the look on my daughter's face when she opened her gift. My daughter Emma was thrilled when she unwrapped the doll. "She's so pretty," she said, hugging it tightly. We decided to place it in the glass display case in her room, where she kept her favorite collectibles. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, I was sitting in the living room reading when I thought I heard something. A faint rustling sound like fabric brushing against wood. I paused, listening, but the house was quiet again. I brushed it off as my imagination. The next morning, Emma came downstairs with the doll in her arms. "Daddy, did you move her last night?" she asked. I frowned. "No, sweetie." "Why?" She tilted her head. "Because I left her sitting on the shelf, but when I woke up, she was on my desk." Over the next few days, the strange incidents continued. I'd find the doll in different positions. Its head tilted, its arms slightly raised, even its chair moved to a different spot in the display case. At first, I thought Emma was playing tricks, but the look on her face told me she was just as confused as I was. Then came the whispering. It started late one night as I was locking up the house. I passed by Emma's room and heard faint murmuring. Assuming she was talking in her sleep, I peeked in to check on her. She was sound asleep, but the whispers continued. They seemed to be coming from the display case. My skin prickled as I walked closer, but the moment I opened the case to inspect the doll, the whispers stopped. By this point, I was genuinely unsettled. Emma was starting to have nightmares about the doll, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the house. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local psychic. She arrived a few days later, a small, sharp-eyed woman who immediately stiffened when she entered the house. She asked to see the doll, and as soon as she laid eyes on it, her expression darkened. "This doll is cursed," she said bluntly. According to her, the doll had belonged to a young girl who had died tragically in a fire. The spirit of the child had latched onto the doll, and her energy was still attached to it. The psychic warned that the spirit wasn't malevolent but was deeply restless. I didn't know what to believe, but after the psychic left, things only got worse. The doll's movements became more noticeable. One night, I found it lying on the floor outside Emma's room, even though the case had been locked. The whispering grew louder, and Emma began waking up in tears, saying she felt like someone was watching her. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the sound of Emma screaming. I ran to her room and found her standing in the corner, trembling. The doll was sitting on her bed, its head turned to face the door. "She moved on her own, Daddy," Emma cried. I knew then that we couldn't keep the doll. The next morning, I packed it up and drove it back to the antique store. The shopkeeper didn't seem surprised when I told him what had happened. "You're not the first," he said quietly, taking the doll from me. After the doll was gone, the house felt lighter and the strange occurrences stopped. But Emma and I still talk about that time, and neither of us can forget the glassy eyes of that porcelain doll, following us wherever we went. Even now, I can't walk past a doll in a store without feeling that same unease, that nagging fear that maybe, just maybe, it's watching me.
There are moments in life when you do something for fun, only to realize too late that you've made a terrible mistake. That Christmas night years ago was one of those moments. It all started with a harmless game. At least that's what we thought. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was buzzing with the sounds of family. Laughing, talking, and the occasional burst of carols from the old record player in the living room. My cousins and I were teenagers then, bored of the grown-ups' conversations and looking for something to do. "Let's check out the attic," my cousin Ben suggested. The attic had always intrigued us. It was a treasure trove of forgotten relics, filled with old furniture, dusty photo albums, and boxes labeled with my grandparents' handwriting. As we rummaged through the clutter, my cousin Lisa found it. A Ouija board, tucked inside a battered cardboard box. "Whoa, this looks ancient," she said, holding it up. The board was weathered, the letters and numbers faded but still legible. The planchette was missing a small chunk from one corner, and it looked like it had seen decades of use or something worse. We carried the board downstairs, laughing at the idea of contacting spirits. It seemed like the perfect way to pass the time while the adults were busy in the other room. We lit a few candles to set the mood, turned off the lights, and sat in a circle around the coffee table. First, nothing happened. We asked the usual silly questions. "Is anyone here with us?" And "What's your name?" And rolled our eyes when the planchette didn't move. But then, as if the board had suddenly come to life, the planchette began to glide across the surface. M-I-R-Y it spelled. "Who's Mary?" Ben asked, his voice wavering. The planchette moved again. D-E-A-D. We all exchanged nervous glances, but none of us let go. As the session went on, the air in the room grew colder. Lisa suddenly shivered. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked, rubbing her arms. Before we could answer, I felt it. An icy, unmistakable pressure on my shoulder, like a hand gripping me. I froze, too afraid to look behind me. "Did you just touch me?" I whispered to Ben, who shook his head, his face pale. The candles flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The planchette began moving faster, almost frantically, spelling out words we couldn't keep up with. "We need to stop," Lisa said, her voice trembling. But when we tried to say goodbye on the board, the planchette refused to move to the word. By this point, we were thoroughly freaked out. Ben suggested we get rid of the board, and Lisa quickly agreed. "Let's burn it," she said. We carried the board to the fireplace, still shaking from what had just happened. Ben tossed it onto the crackling logs, and we waited for it to catch fire. But it didn't. The flames licked at the edges of the board but didn't consume it. It sat there untouched, as if mocking us. Suddenly, the lights in the house began to flicker violently. The Christmas tree's lights blinked erratically, casting the room in unsettling, shifting colors. "Turn it off," Lisa shouted, but before anyone could move, the room went completely dark. When the lights finally came back on, the board was lying in the fireplace, completely intact. Not a single scorch mark marred its surface. We stared at it in stunned silence until my dad walked in, startled by our expressions. "What's going on in here?" he asked, eyeing the candles and the board. We didn't tell him the whole truth, just mumbled something about a spooky game and went to bed. But none of us slept that night. The next morning, we threw the board into the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. Thankfully, the strange occurrences stopped after that, but I still think about it sometimes, especially around Christmas. I wonder if we really managed to get rid of whatever was attached to that board, or if it's still out there somewhere, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim.
Sometimes the most innocent-looking things can hide the darkest secrets. I learned this the hard way one winter, not long after my wife and I had our first child. It started with what seemed like a sweet gesture, but it ended with a memory that still sends chills down my spine. It was just a few weeks before Christmas, and my wife and I were shopping at a small thrift store in town. We weren't wealthy, so we often relied on second-hand finds to make ends meet. While browsing the toy section, my wife spotted it, a soft, well-worn teddy bear. "This looks perfect for Jacob," she said, holding it up. The bear had button eyes, a slightly faded red bow, and a stitched smile. It wasn't flashy, but it had a certain charm. I agreed, and for just a couple of dollars it came home with us. When we gave it to Jacob, he immediately hugged it tightly. "Teddy," he exclaimed, grinning from ear to ear. Watching him so happy melted our hearts. That night, we put Jacob to bed with his new teddy bear tucked snugly under his arm. My wife and I settled in for the evening, thinking nothing of it. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It was a soft, distorted melody. At first, I thought it was coming from the baby monitor, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from Jacob's room. My heart raced as I crept down the hallway and slowly pushed open his door. Jacob was sound asleep, but the teddy bear, his new teddy bear, was sitting upright on the bed, singing a warped lullaby in a slow, haunting tone. I reached for the bear and flipped it over, searching for the battery compartment. To my surprise, there wasn't one. It wasn't electronic, just an ordinary stuffed toy. My pulse quickened as I put the bear back and quietly left the room, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. She laughed nervously. "Maybe you were half asleep," she said. I wanted to believe her, but the unease lingered. The following night, things got worse. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thump. My wife and I rushed to Jacob's room, and there it was, the teddy bear lying in the middle of the floor, several feet away from the bed. "Did Jacob throw it?" my wife asked, but Jacob was fast asleep. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed the bear, stormed outside into the freezing night, and threw it into the trash bin at the curb. "That's the end of that," I muttered. But the next morning, the bear was back, sitting neatly on Jacob's bed as if it had never left. My wife was visibly shaken now. "This isn't normal," she said. We called our priest, Father Andrews, who arrived later that afternoon. He walked through the house, murmuring prayers and sprinkling holy water in each room. When he reached Jacob's room, he stopped and stared at the bear. "There's something wrong with this," he said quietly. He performed a blessing over the bear and instructed us to burn it. That evening, we lit a fire in the backyard and threw the bear into the flames. This time it burned, black smoke curling into the cold night air. The oppressive feeling in the house lifted, and for the first time in days, we felt at peace. We never found out where the bear came from or why it acted the way it did. I still think about it sometimes, wondering if it was cursed or if something far darker had attached itself to it. Jacob doesn't remember much about those nights, he was too young, but every now and then when he sees a teddy bear in a store, he shies away from it. And honestly, I don't blame him. Some things aren't meant to be explained, I tell myself. And some gifts should never be accepted.